Okay, in discussing the theme of this panel, the international legal warfare, or Israel in the international arena, I'm reminded of the aphorism of Clausewitz that war is the continuation of politics by other means. I want to turn this around and say that lawfare is the continuation of war by other means. By lawfare, I mean the delegitimization of Israel under the cover of law, but beyond that, because delegitimization has been a kind of generic theme. What I'm specifically referring to is the laundering or the masking of delegitimization under universal public values, which ends up being prejudicial to those values, let alone to Israel. And so I don't speak here, Danny, as an advocate for Israel. I speak as an advocate for these universal public values that are under assault. And let me speak to these four values, and I'll give one example from each for reasons of time. The first is the laundering of delegitimization under the protective cover of the UN. Every year, in an annual ritual, the United Nations General Assembly adopts 20 resolutions of condemnation against one member state of the international arena, which happens to be Israel, and 4 resolutions against the rest of the world combined. Now, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but what we may not appreciate, as this is a standing denial of international due process, the principle of equality under the UN Charter. This is giving the major human rights violators exculpatory immunity. And each of these resolutions read like legal judgments, findings of fact and conclusions of law. Many of them relate to the issue of settlement. So Israel, in a world in which we live, North America, Europe, etc., in a legal culture, if you say that a country is doing something that is illegal, it's much worse than saying that it's doing something that is stupid or wrong or ill-advised and the like. And to conclude on this first point, there's not only a critical mass of indictment of the singling out of one state for prejudicial indictment. That would be bad enough. There's a critical mass of exposure to that indictment. That process by which those resolutions are adopted is a 3-month, multi-layered process. I was a member of a Canadian delegation to the UN. And so it's not just diplomats who are sitting there. It's parliamentarians, it's journalists, it's academics, it's faith leaders and the like. And in being exposed to this critical mass of indictment, if they come, and many of them do, to the UN as tabula rasa, simply uninformed, they internalize that indictment and the notion of illegality being addressed to Israel. Second is the delegitimization under the authority of international law. Now, Penina gave you some very compelling examples. I'm just going to give you one that she did not have time to address, I suspect, and that is in December 2014, the contracting parties to the Fourth Geneva Convention, the repository, as it were, of international humanitarian law, convened to put one state only, one state in the world, in the docket of the accused. That state happened to be Israel. Not Sudan, not Syria, not Iran, not one state. And the worst thing about it is that this has happened 3 times in the last 50 years. The only state to have been put into the docket of the accused in international humanitarian law was Israel. Third one, the laundering of delegitimization under the culture of human rights. And here I'm going to take as a case study, I'm saying give me one example in each. The UN Council on Human Rights, which as we meet is celebrating its 10th anniversary. Now, this UN Council on Human Rights, it's not just that 50% of its resolutions happen to be against Israel. It's not just that if you go to any meeting of the UN Council on Human Rights, and I've been there, every single meeting, I repeat, every single meeting begins with an agenda-specific indictment of one member state. One item for Israel, then one item, agenda item for the rest of the world combined. Again, think of it in terms of international due process. Every commission of inquiry, whether it be the Goldstone Commission, Operation Protective Edge, has had a mandate which predetermines Israeli criminality to begin with. In Operation Protective Edge, there were 18 separate references to Israeli criminality in the resolution establishing the commission, and not one reference to Hamas itself. And finally, to conclude, in 2016, it reached its nadir or zenith, depending how you look at it, in which Israel was not just one of the only state in the world that was held out to be a violator of women's rights. The only state in the world that was held out to be a violator of health rights. And I can go on. In a word, and Asher reminded me of this statement, in a world in which human rights has emerged as the new secular religion of our time, characterizing Israel as the meta-violator of human rights means that Israel is the new geopolitical antichrist of our time. Last case study is the laundering of delegitimization under the struggle against racism. Let's face it, the worst thing you can do in the world is to label somebody as a racist. The very label supplies the indictment. And if that is not enough, which it was with regard to Zionism and racism, if that is not enough, then you label Israel as an apartheid state. But what we may not appreciate is that apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. So if you say Israel is an apartheid state, what you are saying is that it is a crime against humanity. If it is a crime against humanity, it has no right to be. And if that is not enough, then you also refer to it as a Nazi state. So not only does it have no right to be, but we in the international community have an obligation to ensure that it has no right to be. And again, for those who do not understand the background, context, etc., they just internalize these things. So let me conclude on one point, and it is this, that if we try to make the case that the laundering of delegitimization is prejudicial to Israel, a lot of people, or the delegitimization itself is prejudicial. A lot of people say it should be prejudicial to Israel. Israel warrants being delegitimated. And that's why I say the position we have to take is not that this is prejudicial to Israel, but that it is prejudicial to each of these universal public values that the liberal, progressive community, etc., claim that this is what they care about. In other words, it undermines the integrity of the United Nations. It erodes the authority of international law. It corrupts the culture of human rights, and it shames the real struggle against the real racism, including the real struggle against the real apartheid. So let us get out of the docket of the accused and being defensive, become plaintiffs, become claimants, become melitz yoshers, become public advocates for these universal public values, and then I think we'll be able to mobilize the international community, those who claim they care about this, in the struggle for the pursuit of international justice. Thank you.
Incredibly to the point and under time, which is an incredible achievement.